think perhaps that's it always has been one of the remarkable features. It's one of
The first warning did not arrive through a public statement or dramatic television interview. It came quietly, passed between palace offices in guarded conversations. Meghan Markle was reportedly exploring a path back into royal life, and Princess Anne was already asking the question nobody wanted to answer. At first, the idea sounded almost harmless. There was no demand for a grand restoration, no sudden return to official duties, and no announcement promising that old wounds had healed. The proposal was said to be slower, softer, and far more calculated. A carefully chosen family occasion, a charitable appearance with royal connections, a private meeting presented as reconciliation rather than negotiation. Step by step, Meghan could move closer to the institution without appearing to surrender the independent life she and Harry had fought so fiercely to build. That was the contradiction troubling the palace. Meghan allegedly wanted access to the history, prestige, and global attention attached to the monarchy, but without returning to the restrictions that had once made royal life unbearable. She wanted the door open, yet she did not appear ready to hand back control. To some officials, that made the plan modern and realistic. To others, it made it dangerously one-sided. Harry stood at the center of the tension. For him, the possibility carried hope. A return, even a limited one, could rebuild his relationship with his father, bring his children closer to their royal heritage, and end years of bitterness. But hope came with fear. Harry knew the palace would not welcome Meghan without conditions, and he also knew those conditions might ask her to sacrifice the very freedom their departure had been meant to protect. Around the Sussexes, advisors reportedly saw another opportunity. Hollywood support had become less dependable. Public fascination remained powerful, but not always sympathetic. A renewed royal connection could restore mystery, reopen professional doors, and place Harry and Meghan back at the center of a global story no entertainment contract could fully replace. Inside the palace, however, there was no agreement. Some believed reduced hostility would protect the monarchy and prevent another damaging public feud. Others feared that bringing Meghan back into royal spaces would revive old accusations, private mistrust, and battles over who controlled the narrative. Then there was Anne. Princess Anne had little patience for carefully polished promises. She measured royal service through decades of duty, silence, discipline, and personal sacrifice. Her concern was not simply whether she trusted Meghan. It was whether the proposed arrangement would alter the meaning of service itself. If royal status could be reclaimed without royal restraint, then what did duty still mean? Harry saw a chance for reconciliation. Anne saw a test of whether the palace's rules still carried any power. And as the whispers moved deeper into the palace, Anne began examining not what Meghan was promising, but what she appeared unwilling to give up. On paper, the proposal appeared careful, respectful, and almost impossible to reject. There would be no immediate demand for titles, offices, or official duties. But beneath the language of healing sat a far more ambitious calculation, one that could place Meghan back inside the royal story without restoring royal control. The strategy depended on patience. There would be no dramatic arrival, no sudden announcement that everything had been forgiven. Instead, the return would unfold through small, symbolic steps, each one designed to appear personal rather than political. First might come private contact with family members. Then, perhaps, an invitation to a carefully selected occasion where Meghan's presence could be explained as that of a wife, mother, and daughter-in-law, not a working royal seeking reinstatement. After that, the boundaries could begin to shift. Charitable work offered the safest bridge. A cause with historic royal connections could bring Meghan close to the institution without formally placing her beneath its authority. She could speak about service, compassion, and healing while maintaining the separate platform she had built outside palace walls. Nothing would look permanent. Nothing would appear threatening. Yet every appearance would test public reaction, media fascination, and the strength of palace resistance. For Harry, the plan carried a deeply personal promise. It offered a path back to his father, to the traditions that shaped him, and to a future in which his children would not grow up entirely separated from their royal heritage. He spoke in the language of forgiveness, family, and second chances. But the palace did not speak that language. Officials spoke of precedent, confidentiality, security, and control. Meghan's motives were said to be more complicated. There was emotion in the plan, but there was also strategy. She reportedly wanted acknowledgement that leaving official duty had not erased her place in royal history. She wanted respect at family events, protection from humiliation, and the right to stand beside Harry without being treated as an outsider. Yet that expectation came with a dangerous condition. Meghan might accept royal recognition while resisting limits on interviews, commercial partnerships, public statements, and personal projects. To nervous officials, that created an alarming possibility. The monarchy could become a prestigious backdrop for ventures it could neither supervise nor stop. What looked like reconciliation to Harry looked like exposure to the palace. Every family meeting could become a future story. Every ceremony could feed another media cycle. Every gesture of goodwill could strengthen an outside brand. That was when Anne moved closer. She did not argue publicly. She did not challenge Harry directly. She simply asked to see the conditions attached to the proposal. The request sounded calm, almost routine. But those who knew her understood what it meant. Anne was no longer observing the plan. She was preparing to test it. The more Anne studied the proposal, the clearer her suspicion became. This was not simply a request to come home, it was a demand to redefine what coming home meant. Princess Anne had spent decades obeying rules that were rarely explained and never adjusted for personal comfort. So when she discovered that Meghan's reported return might depend on special freedoms unavailable to other royals, her concern hardened into resistance, and the private debate suddenly became a battle over the crown's authority. Anne had seen the monarchy survive scandals, broken marriages, public fury, and painful changes between generations. She understood that the institution could bend, but she also believed it could not survive if it bent differently for every person who challenged it. In her mind, duty had always demanded the same sacrifice. Personal ambition came second, silence often replaced self-defense, and service continued even when gratitude disappeared. That was why one condition in Meghan's alleged plan disturbed her more than anything else. Meghan could regain royal recognition while continuing independent commercial work, media projects, and public advocacy beyond palace control. To Anne, that was not compromise. It was privilege without restraint. Her questions were direct. Could someone benefit from royal influence while refusing the discipline required to protect it? Would Meghan accept advance approval for major interviews, personal statements, memoir-related material, or projects that mentioned the family? Would she agree that private royal access could not later be used to strengthen an outside platform? The room reportedly became uncomfortable because every question exposed the proposal's weakness. A clear yes might make the return unacceptable to Meghan. A no would confirm Anne's fear that the monarchy was being asked to provide legitimacy without authority. Then she raised the issue nobody wanted to discuss openly: confidentiality. What protection existed if a private meeting later became the foundation of a documentary, interview, podcast, or promotional campaign? What would stop personal conversations from becoming public evidence in another battle over blame? Behind Anne's resistance was a deeper concern. Charles wanted peace. He wanted less distance from Harry and a future that did not leave his family permanently divided. But Anne feared that his desire to heal the relationship could make him accept an arrangement that weakened the very institution he had inherited. Harry saw something colder. To him, the questions proved that certain relatives were preparing barriers before Meghan had even been offered a genuine welcome. His old resentment returned with force. Meghan, meanwhile, reportedly viewed Anne's intervention as an attempt to control the discussion before she could state her own terms. The palace began splitting into opposing camps. Some aides demanded strict written protections. Others warned that turning reconciliation into a legal test would destroy the last chance of bringing Harry closer. Anne was no longer willing to let the argument remain hidden in private notes and cautious conversations. She wanted the people with the power to decide to hear every objection directly. Anne had questioned the plan in private, but her next move would force everyone, including Harry, Meghan, and the king, to confront exactly what a royal comeback would cost. The meeting was expected to discuss logistics, security, and possible dates. Instead, Princess Anne turned it into a reckoning. With senior officials listening and Harry's hopes hanging over every word, she asked one devastating question. Was Meghan returning to serve the monarchy, or returning because she needed the monarchy again? The discussion had been restricted to a small circle: senior palace advisors, representatives close to the king, and officials responsible for security, communications, and royal protocol. They had arrived prepared to debate invitations, family occasions, and the practical shape of a gradual return. Anne refused to begin there. Before dates could be considered, she wanted the purpose defined. Would Meghan accept that royal service demanded accountability, restraint, political neutrality, and limits on personal freedom? Would she submit to the same discipline expected from those who had remained inside the institution? Or was the palace being asked to build a special arrangement around her independence? Anne reportedly challenged the entire idea of a partial comeback. The monarchy, she argued, could not operate like a brand partnership entered when useful and abandoned when uncomfortable. Royal authority came with restrictions. Its influence could not be separated from the burden required to protect it. Then came her strongest warning: precedent. If Meghan received exceptional flexibility, others could eventually demand the same. Future royals might expect ceremonial status without full-time responsibility, public influence without palace control, and institutional protection without institutional obedience. What appeared to be one family compromise could permanently weaken the working monarchy. Anne also questioned who would control the story after private meetings. If disagreements emerged, would palace silence again be interpreted as proof of guilt? Would unnamed sources turn cautious conversations into another public battle? Royal occasions, she warned, could not become stages for unresolved resentment, media speculation, or negotiations carried out through competing headlines. Harry's position was placed before the room. Meghan, he believed, should not have to prove her loyalty before being treated as family. Anne's answer was firm. Family and institution were not the same. Meghan remained connected to the family through Harry, but access to royal duty, symbolism, and authority required a higher standard. That distinction placed Charles under unbearable pressure. As a father, he wanted to reopen the path to his son. As sovereign, he could not ignore a threat to the rules he had inherited. When Meghan learned that Anne had formally questioned whether the proposal protected the crown, the situation changed completely. A private conversation about reconciliation had become an institutional review. Anne then made her final request: suspend informal negotiations until every privilege, condition, and risk had been examined. Anne had delivered the question that changed the entire debate. But the real shock came next, because palace officials did not ignore her warning. They acted on it. Within hours of Anne's intervention, the atmosphere shifted. Friendly discussions became formal reviews, tentative invitations disappeared from consideration, and palace officials began drafting conditions no one expected Meghan to accept. The comeback had not been publicly rejected, but behind closed doors, it was being quietly placed behind a wall. The first move was immediate. Exploratory conversations about Meghan attending future royal occasions in any semi-official role were suspended. Nothing was cancelled publicly, because nothing had ever been formally announced. That was the palace's advantage. It could stop the plan without admitting that the plan had existed. Communications teams were reportedly instructed not to encourage rumors of reconciliation or confirm claims that a return was approaching. Every word would now be controlled. Silence was no longer hesitation. It had become policy. Behind that silence, legal and constitutional advisors began examining the consequences of renewed royal participation. Titles, charitable connections, security, public appearances, and the use of royal status all came under review. What had started as a family question was now being treated as an institutional risk. Officials then began shaping a proposed framework built around one unforgiving principle. Royal access could not support independent commercial power. Meghan and Harry's outside projects would have to remain completely separate from palace events. Private meetings, royal residences, ceremonies, and family conversations could not later appear in documentaries, books, interviews, podcasts, or promotional campaigns. The restrictions went further. Meghan might be required to accept coordinated public messaging, limits on independent announcements, and palace approval before attending occasions carrying royal meaning. For someone who had fought to control her own voice, those conditions struck at the heart of the freedom she had built outside Britain. Security became another pressure point. Officials were unwilling to guarantee automatic protection for appearances that had not been formally approved. The message was clear. Royal resources would follow royal authority, not personal expectation. There was also discussion of a private probationary period. Harry and Meghan could rebuild family contact away from public attention, but no ceremonial return would follow until advisors believed trust had been restored. To palace officials, it was caution. To Meghan, it reportedly looked like an endless test, with rules that could change whenever she came close to passing. Harry reacted with anger. He believed the safeguards treated his wife not as family, but as a threat that had to be contained. Meghan saw something even colder, conditions designed to appear reasonable while making acceptance emotionally and professionally impossible. Charles did not shut the door himself, but he also refused to stop the review. His silence was interpreted as support for Anne's warning. The hopeful comeback had become a controlled test of loyalty. But while officials believed strict conditions would protect the monarchy, Harry saw something else entirely: a final attempt to make Meghan surrender before she was allowed near the palace again. For Harry, the conditions were not safeguards. They were a verdict. Every restriction appeared to confirm his darkest belief that the palace would welcome him only if Meghan returned defeated, silent, and stripped of the independence they had built together. And this time, he was not prepared to remain quiet. At first, disbelief held him still. Then, the meaning of the palace review became impossible to ignore. Anne's objections had not remained the concerns of one determined royal. They had been absorbed into the system, supported by advisors, lawyers, and officials who now spoke with the authority of the crown. Harry's frustration quickly hardened into anger. Other royals, he argued, had survived scandals, commercial controversies, and private failures without being forced through such an elaborate loyalty test. Why was Meghan expected to surrender control of her voice before she could be treated with dignity? To Harry, the answer was obvious. The palace feared her influence, her global reach, and her ability to challenge the story it preferred the public to believe. His feelings toward Anne were more complicated. He respected her discipline and understood the years of service behind her position. But he also saw a coldness in her approach, an unwillingness to accept the pain Meghan believed she had endured. Anne spoke about duty. Harry thought about survival. Meghan reportedly urged him not to respond publicly. An angry interview or statement could confirm every palace warning about confidentiality and control. Yet in private, she faced a harder question. Would accepting these conditions mean admitting that every conflict, accusation, and breakdown had been her fault? That fear created tension between them. Harry still wanted reconciliation. He wanted his father back, wanted his children connected to their heritage, and wanted the bitterness to end. Meghan feared the comeback had become a trap, a process that would draw her close enough to be judged, restricted, and silenced. Their advisors warned them that rejection carried its own danger. The palace could say a reasonable path had been offered and refused. Public sympathy might shift. What Meghan considered impossible conditions could be presented as basic protections. Harry began considering a direct appeal to Charles, not to the king surrounded by officials, but to the father who once knew his fears before the world did. Palace aides anticipated the move and warned Charles that any private agreement could undermine the review and deepen divisions. Anne remained silent. She did not defend herself, soften her position, or offer Harry an easier route. Her silence increased the pressure, because it made clear that she expected him to choose. Harry now faced the choice he had spent years trying to avoid. Accept the palace's authority, abandon the comeback, or force his father into a confrontation no private meeting could contain. King Charles had spent years living with the cost of royal duty. But this decision cut deeper than protocol. One path offered the possibility of seeing his son return without bitterness. The other protected the institution he had inherited. Choosing either one meant losing something he might never recover. Behind the palace silence, Charles was facing a struggle no advisor could solve for him. As a father, he wanted contact with Harry. He wanted the distance reduced, the anger softened, and his grandchildren brought closer to the family history from which they had become separated. But as king, he could not overturn safeguards simply because the pressure had become personal. He understood Anne's warning. She had spent decades defending duty without demanding applause, and her fear was not difficult to grasp. If the palace weakened its rules for one emotional crisis, those rules might never fully recover. Yet Charles also knew that conditions written too tightly could drive Harry away forever. That fear led him toward a quieter possibility. Perhaps reconciliation did not need to begin with ceremonies, titles, public appearances, or carefully staged announcements. Perhaps it could begin privately, with conversations that asked for nothing except patience. His advisors encouraged that separation. Family healing, they argued, should not be confused with Meghan's return to royal life. Harry and Meghan could rebuild contact with Charles and other relatives, but no formal comeback would be considered until trust had been restored over time. To palace officials, the offer was cautious but fair. To Meghan, it reportedly felt deeply unequal. She would be expected to enter private conversations, expose old wounds, and accept emotional vulnerability without any guarantee that the public hostility surrounding her would lessen. She feared the palace could take the appearance of reconciliation while leaving her position unchanged. Harry saw another danger. A private arrangement could be extended endlessly. The palace might claim progress was being made while delaying every serious discussion about security, recognition, and public inclusion. Anne remained unmoved. Trust, she argued, could not be forced through deadlines or exchanged for ceremonial access. Royal participation had to be earned through conduct, not granted because emotional pressure had become unbearable. Charles refused to condemn either side publicly. But his silence created its own storm. Supporters of Harry saw hesitation. Palace loyalists saw caution. Officials prepared for leaks, competing narratives, and a renewed public fight over whether the Sussexes should ever return. The original comeback remained suspended. Still, Charles left one narrow path open: private reconciliation first, and a future review only if trust survived without immediate reward. For Harry and Meghan, the truth was painful. The door had not closed completely, but it would no longer open on their terms. The king had left a narrow path forward, yet before Harry and Meghan could decide whether to take it, one final palace calculation threatened to change the meaning of their royal future forever. There was no dramatic banishment, no public declaration, and no final royal decree. Instead, the palace delivered something colder: silence, conditions, and time. Meghan's comeback remained technically possible, but the version she had imagined was gone, and Princess Anne had permanently changed the price of returning. What had begun as an optimistic plan for gradual re-entry had become a narrow, heavily controlled path with no promise of public restoration. The palace had not said never. It had said not yet, not without proof, and certainly not on terms written outside its walls. Anne's intervention had created a separation that could no longer be ignored. Meghan could remain part of the family through Harry, but family connection would not automatically restore royal participation. Private contact was one thing. Titles, charitable roles, ceremonial appearances, and institutional authority were something else entirely. The timeline now belonged to palace officials. Trust would have to be rebuilt quietly, without cameras, public rewards, or guarantees. Only after a period of stability would the question of any visible comeback return to the table. For Meghan, that choice carried a painful meaning. Accepting the rules could be presented as reconciliation, but it might feel like surrender. She would have to enter a system that demanded restraint before offering recognition, while knowing that critics would treat every hesitation as proof that she had never truly wanted peace. Harry faced a different wound. Could he rebuild a relationship with his father while Meghan and their children remained outside the royal circle? Could he accept private affection without public acknowledgement? Or would that deepen the sense that his family was being welcomed in pieces? Anne's position remained unchanged. The monarchy, she believed, could not survive if its rules were rewritten whenever personal pressure became powerful enough. Charles, however, remained trapped between compassion and caution. Delay might protect the crown, but it could also make reconciliation impossible. Outside the palace, the next battle was already forming. Meghan's supporters could see the conditions as punishment disguised as procedure. Her critics could argue that the institution had finally drawn necessary boundaries. The Sussexes might now strengthen their independent identity, turning the failed comeback into a wider argument about exclusion, control, and who has the power to define royal belonging. Yet future family events, anniversaries, health concerns, or sudden crises could force the question back into the open. Anne had not locked the door forever. She had done something more consequential. She had made certain Meghan could never walk through it without first accepting who held the keys. And with the comeback frozen but not destroyed, the next chapter will depend on one unanswered question. Will Meghan accept the palace's rules or reveal why she believes those rules were written to keep her out?